Liam, a young mechanical engineer, arrived at the old industrial factory on the outskirts of town. The place had been abandoned for over a decade, left to decay in silence. Yet, the company had recently purchased the land, eager to resurrect the long-forgotten machinery. Liam, excited for the challenge, had no idea what awaited him. As he entered the factory, the musty scent of rusted metal and aged oil filled his nostrils. The old engine room stood at the back of the factory, untouched, as if frozen in time. Dust settled thickly on the surfaces, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally. But what drew his attention the most was the faint hum, like a whisper, coming from the room. Liam shook his head, wondering if his mind was playing tricks. He hadn't seen another soul in the building, but something about the sound, it was almost alive. He approached the engine room, his heart beating faster. The door creaked as it slowly opened. Inside, the massive, rusted engines loomed, but it was the humming sound that caught him. It was louder now, almost urgent. Liam couldn't figure out where it was coming from. With the flick of his flashlight, the beam landed on something strange. An old, worn-out control panel in the corner of the room. It was active. His curiosity pushed him closer, but the moment he touched the panel, the humming stopped. The silence was deafening. Liam stood there, unsure of what to do next. Was this just a malfunction? Or was there something more to the factory? Something he wasn't meant to uncover? Liam's fingers trembled as they hovered over the control panel. The room seemed to close in around him. The air felt thick, heavier than it should have been, pressing against his chest with an almost suffocating intensity. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, something in the shadows just beyond the reach of his flashlight. His hand moved involuntarily, pressing a button on the old, rusted panel. The moment he did, the faint humming noise returned, this time louder and more erratic, like a heartbeat. But it wasn't just the sound that made his skin crawl, it was the way the machinery seemed to shift. The massive engines in the room groaned, their ancient gears turning with unnatural precision, as if something or someone was commanding them. The lights flickered above him, casting long, twisting shadows along the walls that seemed to move on their own. Liam's breath quickened, his mind racing. This shouldn't be happening. These machines hadn't been in operation for years, and yet they were moving. Suddenly, the humming sound stopped, replaced by a deep guttural growl, a noise so low and vibrating that it seemed to come from the very floor beneath him. The lights above flickered one last time before going out, plunging the room into complete darkness. The growl grew louder, more insistent. His pulse pounded in his ears. Liam's mind raced. Was there someone else in the room? No. He had checked the building thoroughly before coming in. It was empty, and yet, the sensation of being watched intensified, as if eyes were burning into him from every corner. Then he heard it, a faint scraping sound, like nails dragging across metal. He whipped his head to the side, his flashlight shaking in his hand as the beam sliced through the blackness. Nothing. The shadows in the corner of the room seemed deeper now, thicker, almost alive. The scraping continued, growing louder, closer. He stepped backward, his breath shallow, heart thumping in his chest. And then he saw it. A figure, or rather, the silhouette of a figure, tall and hunched, with elongated arms that dragged across the ground. It was moving toward him slowly, impossibly slow, its limbs jerking unnaturally, like a puppet controlled by unseen strings. Liam froze, his body. The air in the room had changed. It was no longer just heavy. It felt oppressive, like the factory itself was suffocating him. Liam's chest tightened, his breath shallow and erratic. His legs were weak, but he forced himself to back away from the corner where the figure had stood. The smile it wore, twisted and grotesque, burned into his memory. It was as though it knew his deepest fears and was savoring them. But there was no time to dwell on that. The growl had returned, deeper, closer. The walls seemed to close in around him, the echoes of the sound reverberating through the factory like a deep, monstrous drumbeat. He could feel it vibrating in his skull, gnawing at his thoughts. His mind swirled with confusion, terror, and something else. Something darker. It was as though the factory was calling to him, beckoning him into the depths of its long-forgotten heart. The machinery, the engines, the control panel, all of it seemed to pulse with life now. It wasn't just that the gears were turning. It was as if the entire room was alive, breathing with him, drawing him closer to something unspeakable. Liam's pulse raced as the lights flickered again. This time, they didn't flicker out. No, they grew brighter, casting an eerie glow that illuminated the machinery in harsh, unnatural light. And that's when he saw it. In the center of the room, beneath the looming engines, the shadows began to twist and writhe. They weren't just shadows anymore. They were shapes, dark, amorphous forms that seemed to move with a life of their own. They grew larger, coiling around the engines like serpents, thickening the air with a palpable sense of dread. The walls groaned, and from the very foundations of the building came a low, grinding noise, like something ancient was being disturbed from its slumber. Liam stumbled backward, his breath catching in his throat. The growling had become a chorus now, a choir of voices that seemed to seep from the very walls. They were distorted, disjointed, as if they were speaking in a language not meant for human ears. And then the air went still. The hum from the machines faded into a deafening silence. But that wasn't the worst of it. Liam turned his head slowly, almost unwilling to face what he knew he would see. The figure was there again, closer this time. Its long, elongated limbs scraped the floor, dragging against the metal with a horrible, grating sound. But now it wasn't just standing there, watching. No, now it was moving toward him with an unnatural, jerking gait. Its glowing eyes pierced through the darkness like twin red suns, cold and unblinking. The smile had stretched even wider, revealing rows of jagged, black teeth that glinted in the dim light. Liam's heart hammered in his chest, each beat louder than the last. His throat closed up, making it impossible to scream, to call for help. He was utterly alone. And yet, the figure was getting closer, its presence overwhelming, suffocating him. He tried to move, but his legs refused to obey. Every time he attempted to step back, the air seemed to resist him, as if the very atmosphere had become a prison. The cold, clammy sensation of being trapped in something far too large, far too ancient, gnawed at him. The growling intensified, and Liam's vision began to blur. The factory around him twisted into something unrecognizable. What had once been a room full of rusted machines now appeared as though it had been distorted by some malevolent force. The walls stretched and shrank, the floors groaned and shifted. The sound of chains dragging echoed from the depths of the building, far down the hallway, from rooms Liam had never dared to enter. And then, just as he thought he couldn't take it anymore, the lights above him flickered once more and everything went dark. Complete and utter darkness. Liam's breath caught in his throat, his entire body frozen in place. For a long moment, nothing happened. The oppressive silence was deafening. But then, from the blackness came the sound. A faint whisper at first, but growing louder, clearer with each passing second. "Welcome to my home." The voice was low. The darkness seemed to swallow everything. Every sound, every breath. Liam's mind raced as the cold hands of panic gripped him. The figures surrounding him weren't just shadows. They were beings, and the more he looked, the more he saw. Their twisted forms shifted in unnatural ways, their long limbs jerking as though they were not bound by the laws of nature. Their skin, if you could call it that, was mottled and stretched thin over skeletal frames, the texture resembling weathered leather, decayed and covered in what looked like scars. And their eyes burned with a terrible red glow, the light of pure hatred, but also a deep, insatiable hunger. Liam couldn't look away. He wanted to run, but his feet wouldn't obey. His body was frozen, his skin crawling, every instinct screaming at him to get out. Yet he couldn't move. He could only watch as the figures closed in on him, their twisted faces contorting into what could only be described as twisted smiles. But the most terrifying thing wasn't their appearance. It was the silence. They didn't speak. They didn't make a sound. Not even the scrape of their feet against the concrete floor. It was as if they were waiting for something. Waiting for him. Liam swallowed hard, his throat dry. Every instinct told him to scream, but the fear was paralyzing, robbing him of his voice. The silence stretched on, suffocating him, pressing against his chest with a weight he couldn't bear. He could feel his heart hammering in his chest, each beat ringing in his ears. His breaths were shallow, desperate. He couldn't take much more. Then the darkness shifted. The faint glow from the machines flickered, casting fleeting shadows against the walls. And for the first time, Liam saw something new. In the far corner of the room, there was a doorway, an archway that he hadn't noticed before. It was small, hidden behind a mound of old, rusted pipes and machinery. But now, in the flickering light, he could see it clearly. And in the doorway, standing just beyond the threshold, was a figure, unlike the others. This one was different, taller, more imposing. Its skin wasn't mottled like the others. It was smooth, pale, with a faint, sickly sheen to it, like death itself had crawled beneath the surface. Its eyes were not red like the others, but black, completely black. They looked into him with an intensity that sent a chill deeper than anything he had ever felt. The figure took a step forward, and Liam felt a pull in his chest, an invisible force that seemed to tug at his very soul, urging him toward the figure. His body moved of its own accord, one step, then another. No matter how hard he tried to fight it, his legs moved closer. The cold grip of fear tightened around his throat as the figure's black eyes fixed on his. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. Liam's body was no longer his own. The factory had taken control of him, just as it had taken control of everything else inside it. He was but a marionette, his strings pulled by something far darker, far older. The figure stepped closer, and now Liam could see the details of its face, if you could call it a face. It was distorted, featureless except for the empty, hollow eyes and a jagged mouth that stretched unnaturally wide, as if it had been torn open. The figure reached out a hand. Long fingers, tipped with nails like blackened claws, stretched toward him. The air around it crackled, a low hum rising from the depths of the factory. The machinery, the engines, the very walls seemed to shudder as the figure drew closer. Liam wanted to scream, but nothing came out. His throat was dry, his mouth a desert. The darkness had consumed him completely. It was no longer just the physical space, the walls, the machinery, the factory's lifeless corridors, but something far more insidious. The shadows wrapped themselves around his mind, twisting his thoughts into grotesque shapes, distorting his memories into fragments that no longer made sense. He wasn't just trapped in the factory. The factory was inside him, clawing at his soul, twisting his very essence. Liam staggered back, his body numb, as though every movement was sluggish and weighed down by invisible chains. The oppressive silence had returned, suffocating him, pressing on his chest until it felt like he was drowning. His skin was cold, clammy, and every step he took echoed, each footfall amplifying the overwhelming sense of doom that had settled deep within his bones. He was surrounded by them, the figures, the twisted souls that had once walked this factory, now bound to it by dark forces. Their eyes followed him, unblinking, watching his every move. But it wasn't just their gaze that paralyzed him. No, it was the presence of them, the sense that they were waiting for him to understand that there was no escape, waiting for him to accept the truth that the factory was alive, the truth that the factory wanted him. He had always known there was something wrong with this place. The way it hummed, the way the machines seemed to groan with life, the way the shadows moved and twisted. But now, standing in the heart of it, he could feel it. The pulse of the factory, the beating heart of an ancient, malevolent entity that had consumed everything in its path. And now it was after him. Liam's legs trembled as he took another step, his pulse racing in his ears. His mind was screaming for him to run, but his feet betrayed him, refusing to move. The very air felt thick with dread, each breath a struggle. He could feel the factory closing in around him, its dark embrace tightening like a vice. And then the whispering started again. At first, it was soft, almost inaudible, like the faint murmur of voices just beyond his hearing. But it grew louder, clearer, until it was all-encompassing. The voices spoke in an unholy chorus, a dissonant blend of despair, malice, and hunger. Their words bled together, unintelligible but full of promise. Promises of freedom, promises of release. But there was no release, not for Liam. He pressed his hands to his ears, but the whispering didn't stop. It seeped into his mind, a tide of madness that threatened to drown him. His vision blurred, the factory warping in front of him, bending and twisting into impossible shapes. The walls were closing in. The figures around him grew closer, their twisted faces becoming more distinct. Their mouths stretched wide in grotesque smiles, revealing rows of teeth that were far too many, far too sharp. "Join us!" The voice came from everywhere, from every direction. It was low, guttural, filled with a hunger that made his skin crawl. He felt the cold, clammy breath of the... Liam's mind felt like it was unraveling, a tapestry of thoughts torn apart by the force of the factory's grip on his soul. The pain, the sheer agony of being pulled apart from the inside was too much to bear. Every inch of his body burned, and yet, it was nothing compared to the hunger he felt deep within him. The factory wasn't just a place. It was a living, breathing entity that thrived on torment, on consuming everything in its path. But it wasn't finished with him. Liam's eyes snapped open, and for a moment, he didn't know where he was. His body felt cold, limp, and heavy. His limbs barely responded to his commands. His skin felt tight, as though something had changed inside of him, something that wasn't there before. The pain had subsided, but now there was only the void, an emptiness that stretched endlessly, suffocating him from the inside out. He tried to stand, to move, but his body wouldn't obey. The walls of the factory, if that's even what this place still was, shifted around him. They were no longer solid. They bent, pulsated, like they were alive, breathing. The floor beneath him cracked and groaned, as though it was on the verge of splitting open. "Welcome back," the voice rasped, echoing through the room. It wasn't the creature anymore. It was the factory itself, its voice everywhere, inside his mind and outside it. It had claimed him now, mind, body, and soul. Liam's head snapped to the side. The shadows, those crawling, twisting masses, began to shift, to coalesce into forms. They were alive. They weren't just shapes. They were bodies, hunched and broken, their limbs bending at impossible angles, like marionettes whose strings had snapped. The figures didn't move in the same way they had before. No longer slow or hesitant, they now scuttled, like spiders, their unnatural movements quick, jerking with an awful fluidity. The air grew thick with the sound of their crawling, their breath, the scraping of their nails against the concrete. Liam was no longer sure if they were truly human anymore. They couldn't be. Their faces were nothing but hollow, skinless sockets, or warped masks of flesh, stretched grotesquely with jagged teeth that were far too many, too sharp. Their eyes were voids, black as pitch, but they still managed to see him with an intensity that froze him to the spot. "You're one of us now," one of them hissed, its voice a wet, slithering sound, like something deep underwater. It was different from the others. The voice held a sense of recognition, a sense of ownership. Liam's heart hammered in his chest. He couldn't breathe. The world around him spun. The walls seemed to pulse with the same rhythmic beat, and then he saw it. Through the shifting darkness, there was a light, distant and faint, but it was there, a way out. His instincts screamed at him to move, to run, but his body felt frozen, anchored to the ground by invisible chains. The figures began to move closer, surrounding him. Their faces twisted into expressions of sick glee, eyes gleaming with hunger. They were drawn to him like moths to a flame. Liam's mind screamed for him to fight, to escape. But how? The factory was everywhere. It was in his bones, in his blood, in the very air that choked him. He was trapped, bound to this cursed place. And then, from the deep recesses of the factory, came the sound. A slow, rhythmic thrum that started deep beneath the floor, vibrating in his chest. It grew louder, rising until it filled the room. The thrum became a hum, a low, buzzing noise that seemed to call to him, pulling him deeper into the darkness. "She's calling you," the figure hissed again, stepping closer. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dark, and Liam could feel the heat from its body. Its unnatural heat. It wasn't just a physical sensation. No, it was something far more invasive. It was as though the figure's very presence was burning him from the inside. The hum intensified, growing into something more, a song. It wasn't something Liam could hear with his ears alone. It was in his mind, seeping into his thoughts like a poison, changing them. His thoughts, his memories began to shift, twist, melt away. It wasn't just the factory feeding on him. Liam's fall felt endless. The blackness surrounded him, pressing in from all sides, as if the very air itself was a living thing, choking him with its weight. He couldn't see, couldn't move, couldn't breathe. His limbs were numb, and his mind spun in a dizzying whirlpool of fear and confusion. Every part of him screamed for release, for escape, but there was no escape from this. No way out. The sound of his descent was deafening. His body crashed against unseen obstacles, slamming into cold, jagged metal. The fall felt eternal, as though the factory itself had no bottom. It had no end. It was the abyss, the void, and Liam was falling into it, helpless and alone. When he finally landed, it was soft, unnaturally soft, like a mattress of decay. He gasped for air, but all he tasted was the bitter, metallic tang of the factory's breath. The air was thick with something vile, something that tasted like iron and rot. He could feel it, seeping into his lungs, crawling into his veins. Liam lay still for a moment, his mind reeling. He tried to move, but his body refused to cooperate. Every part of him ached, bruised from the fall, but there was something else. The numbness was spreading. It wasn't just physical. It was as though the factory had entered him, seeped into his very cells, making him part of it. The ground beneath him shifted. He pushed himself up, panic rising in his chest. His hands touched something cold, smooth, and slick, like glass. He looked down, his eyes barely able to adjust to the dim, flickering light that seeped from cracks in the walls. What he saw made his stomach lurch. The floor was covered in some kind of viscous, dark liquid. It gleamed like oil, but it was more than that. It wasn't just liquid, it was alive. It moved, pulsing with a terrible rhythm, like the factory's heartbeat. Liam's hands trembled as they sank into the blackness. It was warm, disturbingly so, and it felt like it was sucking him in, pulling him toward the center of the room. The walls around him were no better. They were covered in strange, organic growths, like tendrils, coiling and stretching toward him, as if the factory itself was reaching out, hungry for him. The air was thick with the hum of machinery, but now it was distorted, broken, warped by something far darker, far more ancient. The low growl he had heard before seemed to echo from the depths of the factory, as though the very foundation was alive with hunger. Liam's heart pounded in his chest as he struggled to get to his feet. His body screamed in protest, each movement sending waves of pain through him. But he couldn't stop. He couldn't stay here, not in this nightmare. He pushed forward, stumbling through the thick liquid, the walls closing in around him. The hum was growing louder, now accompanied by a new sound. A scraping, scratching noise that reverberated through the factory like the sound of claws on metal. And then, from the depths of the darkness, came a voice that wasn't human. It was deep, guttural, filled with a power that seemed to shake the very air around him. "You belong to me now, Liam." Liam's heart pounded like a drum, each beat vibrating through his chest, deafening him with its urgency. His body screamed in agony as he pushed forward, stumbling through the pitch-black void. His legs felt like lead, each step a struggle, as if the very floor beneath him was trying to drag him back. The walls of the factory seemed to pulse with an eerie rhythm, like a heartbeat. The air was thick, suffocating, swirling with the scent of decay and iron. It clung to him, seeping into his skin, into his lungs. He couldn't stop. Not now. He had to keep moving. He couldn't let the factory win. Behind him, the sound of shifting metal and grinding gears grew louder, as though the walls themselves were alive, closing in, chasing him. The factory wasn't just a place. It was a beast, a monstrous, insatiable thing that fed on fear, on pain, on the very souls of those it trapped. And it was hungry. It was hungry for him. Liam's breath came in ragged gasps, his vision blurry, his body trembling from exhaustion and the unbearable weight of the darkness around him. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to escape, to survive. The ground trembled beneath him once more, and Liam's foot caught on something slick. He collapsed to the floor, the shock sending a jolt of pain through his body. The liquid, thick and black, like oil, slithered across the floor, seeping into his clothes, coating his skin. It was as if the very floor was alive, pulling him into its depths. It dragged at him, pulling him backward, trying to swallow him whole. He could feel its hunger, its greed, reaching into him like an invisible hand, gripping him tighter with every passing second. "No," Liam gasped, his voice barely a whisper. "No, I won't be part of you." He dug his fingers into the floor, his nails scraping against the cold, metal surface. He could feel the factory's pulse beneath him, its heartbeat, and it was growing stronger. It wasn't just in the walls anymore. It was in him. He could feel it in his veins, in his blood. The factory had become a part of him, and it wanted him to join it. But Liam wasn't done. Not yet. He wasn't ready to be consumed. With one last burst of strength, he yanked his hand free from the viscous liquid and pushed himself up, stumbling toward the distant glow that beckoned him like a faint, dying star. He didn't know where it led, but it was the only way forward. He didn't care if it was a lie. He didn't care if it was the factory's final trap. He would not let it take him. As he moved, the floor shifted again. This time it didn't feel like metal, felt softer, like flesh. The walls groaned, and the ground beneath him seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting, pulsating with a rhythm too slow, too deliberate. The sound of the creature, the heart of the factory, was growing louder, echoing in the darkness. The growl that had once been distant now shook the very air around him. The light ahead grew brighter, almost blinding now, and Liam could feel something calling to him from within it. But it wasn't salvation. It wasn't freedom. It was the factory's true form. It was the heart of the beast, beating, waiting for him to finally come to terms with his fate. "No!" Liam screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the factory's hunger. He pressed on, faster now, his mind fraying at the edges, his thoughts slipping. The voices began to whisper again, soft at first, like the hum of a lullaby. But it wasn't soothing. It was a command. It was calling him, pulling him toward the light, toward the heart. He didn't want to go. He didn't want to become part of this nightmare. But the factory had already taken so much from him. His strength, his will, his sanity. He could feel his grip on reality slipping, his sense of self breaking down, piece by piece, until he was nothing more than a puppet, strung along by the factory's cruel whispers. The light was so close now. He could see it clearly. It wasn't a door. It wasn't a window. It was the core of the factory. An enormous, pulsating mass of blackened, twisted machinery and organic matter. The walls were nothing but veins, the floor a vast network of arteries, and in the center, the beating heart of the factory. And standing before it, waiting for him, was the creature. It was no longer just a figure. It had grown, expanded, become something more. Its body was now a monstrous amalgamation of flesh and steel, its limbs impossibly long, its mouth wide, jagged teeth glinting in the light. Its eyes, those hollow, black eyes, stared at him with an endless, consuming void. "Come closer, Liam." The voice rumbled, deep and resonant, filling the room with its weight. Liam could feel it, the pull, the force drawing him in, tugging at his very soul. It was stronger than any fear he had ever known. He wasn't just in the factory anymore. He was the factory. The darkness stretched on forever. It wasn't the same suffocating blackness that had once surrounded him. It was colder now, deeper. The factory had consumed him, swallowed his body and soul into its grotesque heart. But something lingered, something alive. Liam's consciousness, if it could still be called that, drifted, broken and fragmented. He was no longer sure of where he ended and the factory began. His thoughts were scattered, slipping through his fingers like smoke. But there was one thing he could still sense. Pull, a tug, deep within him. It wasn't pain, at least not in the way he'd known before. It wasn't agony. It was something else. It was hunger. The factory's hunger. For the first time since the nightmare began, Liam felt something stir inside him. Something other than fear. It was as if the factory had left a piece of itself inside him. A splinter that had burrowed deep into his soul. And now that piece was calling to him just as the factory had called to him before. It was feeding on him, growing, reshaping him. But Liam wasn't sure if he was still Liam anymore. His thoughts were splintered, his mind fraying at the edges. His body felt like it no longer belonged to him, as if the very essence of his being had been absorbed into the factory, merged with its flesh, its steel, its dark machinery. The heartbeat, the pulse of the factory was everywhere now. It was inside him, inside his very mind, vibrating through his chest like a drumbeat, rhythmic and unrelenting. It was as though the factory had become a part of him, a parasite feeding on what little was left of his humanity. The cold began to seep into him. It wasn't the cold of the factory's walls or the endless black void that surrounded him. No, this cold was deeper. It was in his bones, in his veins. The cold was inside him, burrowing into the very core of who he had been, stripping away the last remnants of himself. Then the whispering began. It started faint, a distant murmur, like the faintest hint of wind moving through a forgotten hallway. But it grew louder, clearer. It was a voice. No, voices. Dozens of them, hundreds, speaking in a chorus of hissing whispers. The words too distorted to understand, but the tone unmistakable. It was a command. It was the factory speaking, not just in words, but in sensation. It was urging him to come closer, to give in, to merge with it completely. Liam tried to scream, but his voice was lost, swallowed by the dark. He could feel his body, what was left of it, cracking, shifting, twisting. His flesh was no longer his own. It felt as though the walls of the factory were being pulled into him, their cold metal and oily liquid coursing through his veins. And then he saw it, the factory, not as the sprawling, decaying structure it had once been, but as something alive, something that pulsed and breathed like a living creature. The machines, the heart of the factory, were no longer mechanical. They were fused with something far worse, something ancient and vile. Metal and flesh, wires and sinew, bones and gears, all tangled together. Liam's mind reeled in agony as the door, the last hope for his escape, disappeared into the endless abyss. The factory's grip on him tightened, suffocating him in its unrelenting hunger. The walls, the floor, the very air, it was all part of the same thing. The factory was alive, and it had claimed him, mind and soul. His body shook with a final, desperate attempt to fight, but it was futile. The darkness was too thick, the hunger too powerful. He could feel it creeping through him, dragging him deeper into the heart of the factory. His limbs no longer obeyed him. His skin felt like it was burning from the inside out, the heat of the factory's insatiable appetite spreading through him like wildfire. "You are mine," the voice hissed again, echoing through the very depths of his mind. It was no longer a whisper. It was a roar, a cacophony of pure, unrelenting malice that filled every corner of his thoughts. "You belong to me. Forever. The figures, those twisted, lost souls, emerged from the shadows once again. They had no faces, no eyes, only empty sockets, only hunger. They were nothing but remnants of the factory's victims, consumed, transformed into something less than human. They crawled toward him, their unnatural movements like the jerking of broken marionettes. Liam stumbled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The factory's pulse, its heartbeat, was now a physical sensation, throbbing inside his chest, shaking his body to its core. It was feeding on him, breaking him down piece by piece, like a predator savoring its kill. He couldn't think. He couldn't breathe. He was drowning in the darkness, in the hunger. Every inch of his body screamed. Every atom of his being fought for release, for an end to the torment. But the factory was relentless. The shadows closed in around him, its walls pressing in, suffocating him with every breath. The figures reached him, their twisted, skeletal hands grasping at him, pulling him deeper into the abyss. He could feel their cold fingers slide beneath his skin, digging into his flesh like claws, dragging him further into the heart of the factory. The pain was unbearable, like fire and ice mixed together, searing through every nerve. Liam's vision blurred, and he saw flashes of his past, his life before all of this. The smell of fresh air, the warmth of sunlight, the sound of laughter, the simple joy of being human. But those memories were fading, slipping away like sand through his fingers. The factory was taking it all, the memories, the emotions, the humanity. It was stripping him down to nothing. The factory had always been hungry, but now it was starving, and Liam was the last meal. In a final, fleeting moment of clarity, Liam understood the truth. The factory wasn't just a place. It was a curse. It was a living, breathing entity that had existed long before humanity had even set foot on this land. It had been here for centuries, maybe longer, feeding on the souls of the lost, the broken, the desperate. It needed them, needed to consume them to survive. And now it had consumed him. But in that moment of clarity, in the darkness that threatened to consume him whole, Liam realized something else. Something small yet powerful. He could still choose. With the last vestiges of his strength, he reached inside himself. He grasped that flickering ember of defiance, that tiny spark of humanity that the factory had overlooked. He held onto it with everything he had left. The hunger gnawed at him. The darkness threatened to swallow him whole. But he fought. He fought against the pull of the factory. And in that fight, something happened. The factory screamed. The walls trembled. The machinery groaned in protest. And for a brief, terrifying moment, the darkness faltered. The hunger paused. Liam's spark of defiance had pierced through the factory's insatiable hunger. It had broken its control just enough. But it wasn't enough to escape. The shadows closed in again, and the hunger returned with a vengeance. It engulfed him, swallowing the last bit of his humanity. Liam screamed, not in pain but in realization. He was no longer Liam. He was part of the factory now, a cog in its endless, eternal cycle of hunger. His memories, his life, everything that made him human, was being erased, rewritten, and consumed. And as the final fragments of his identity were ripped away, the factory pulsed one last time. The dark machinery groaned, and the figures that had once been his tormentors faded into the shadows, leaving behind only the cold, relentless presence of the factory. It was never over. Liam's body was no longer his own. His mind was gone. His soul had been consumed, folded into the factory's eternal hunger. He had become a part of it, just like all the others before him. And like the others, his story would be forgotten. But the factory would never forget. It was hungry, and it would always hunger for more.